want to start with just some motivating facts that we're going to use to try to understand over the rest of the time. This is a graph of population change by 1/2 kilometer CBD distance radii going out from the CBD for it's the medians across the top 120 metro areas in the US since 1970. And kind of what I want to focus on here is that, yes, we know there's a lot of urban decline in the 70s, but even starting in the 80s, right at the CBD, you saw population growth that was, maybe about the same, maybe a little bit less than what you saw in the suburbs, and then a little bit more in the 90s. And then since 2000, you've seen this very rapid growth within about 2 kilometers of CBDs that tails off very quickly. In fact, if you look at the area within like 1/2 kilometer of CBDs in terms of population growth, it's been the fastest growing neighborhoods in the country as a function of CBD distance. So that's one dimension. Another dimension is to look at fraction of the population that's white. Since 2000, these are the only neighborhoods with a growing white population as the country has become more minority, and the white fraction has been declining. If you look at fraction college graduate, you see also that in the 2000 to 2010 period, these neighborhoods near CBDs have becoming more educated. So, these are the most rapidly growing neighborhoods in this dimension as well. Okay, so there's a lot of kind of interesting neighborhood change going on in downtowns, and there's a few papers that think about this, and so we're going to try to think about this in some of the same dimensions and some different dimensions, and try to understand what's going on here. Okay, so I want to kind of going to have 3 stages here to what I do. The first stage is just to describe some patterns of central neighborhood change since 1980 in US metropolitan areas along the lines that I showed you just now. And then I'm going to take kind of procedure from labor economics that for decomposing wage distributions that was developed, or proposed, I should say, by Donardo Fortin-Lemieux, and apply that to neighborhood demographics, and decompose neighborhood change at the census tract level into kind of components that have to do with changes in neighborhood choices or demand by specific demographic groups, and demographic change, which I'll call quantity components, to construct a bunch of counterfactual neighborhoods to help us think about which groups changes in choices and which groups changes in sort of shares of the population have been driving these changes in central neighborhoods. And then once we've learned kind of what we get from doing that, I want to estimate a neighborhood choice model that will tell us ultimately the reasons that demands have changed for central neighborhoods by each demographic group we look at, and will allow us to do kind of a unified decomposition of reasons for changes in central neighborhoods. So really, this is going to be a decomposition up here, and then the choice components, that is the changes in demand for central neighborhoods by specific demographic groups, we're going to use the model to help us perform a unified decomposition of that, okay? And do a full accounting at the end, okay? So kind of what I'm going to show you in the first decomposition, or as a result of it, is that in the 1980 to 2000 period, you had kind of departures of low socioeconomic status, whites, blacks, and others. Those are our 3 racial groups. But relative stability of college whites in downtown neighborhoods. And then since 2000, a return of college-educated whites. That's going to account for some of the growth in the white fraction. But stabilization of basically of the departures of less educated whites, that's going to account for some as well, but a continued departure of low socioeconomic status minorities. Okay? And at the same time, you kind of have this demographic change as the population has become more minority and more college educated, which have both pushed for population growth in downtown areas, just kind of through a mechanical mechanism. Okay, so then in terms of thinking about why these neighborhood choices have changed, especially among so why it is that college-educated whites have returned and less educated minorities have continued to depart, we kind of have this decomposition where we think about the role of housing costs, labor market opportunities, observed amenities, and unobserved amenities. Okay? We use the model to help us decompose these things. And we don't find much of a role for housing costs. In terms of labor market opportunities, there was kind of a stabilization of downtown employment declines that were occurring before 2000. And that was particularly important for incentivizing the sort of less educated whites to stop leaving. Okay? So that's going to play a role. But the most important role is going to be for particularly unobserved amenities, and this echoes some evidence elsewhere in the literature, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it's going to be important for driving post-2000 reversals in demand for downtown neighborhoods by whites. It's going to be important in the sense that we find that downtown neighborhoods are an inferior good for less than college non-whites in particular. And that's been an important kind of reason for them to continue to leave. Okay? So I'll like kind of be able to tell you a little bit about why I think that's true and why our evidence suggests that once I show you the model later on. Okay. So I think there are two other kind of notable papers that are doing something similar. So I just wanted to relate what we're doing to what they're doing, because I think I hope we can all contribute to this understanding of sort of neighborhood dynamics, and in particular downtown neighborhood dynamics. Couture and Hamburger's paper is a very nice paper. They really focus on the college-educated, and they really do a great job at sort of looking at the role of amenities. And they find, like we do, that amenity shifts in demand for amenities have been really important. And I would say if you want to understand what it is about amenities and which amenities, they're the paper to look at. So we don't have as much to say about that. We have kind of a broader demographic look, because they only look at this one group. And then Edlund et al. Also try to understand kind of downtown revivals, and they primarily look at labor demand conditions and how they matter. And so we're going to kind of do these together to try to come up with a unified decomposition. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the 120 largest CBSAs, metro areas in the US, and we're going to focus on census tracts within 4 kilometers of CBDs. Our model, for example, will accommodate the potential to choose to live in any census tract in this sample area. We're going to have some statistics that I show you that uses just an equally weighted z-score of fraction white, median income, and fraction college, just to kind of summarize sort of demographic change in downtown neighborhoods. I'll say that the regions within 4 kilometers of CBDs had lower than average socioeconomic status relative to the CBSA, except in 2 cities in 1980. This is New York City and Santa Barbara. But we had 73 of our 120 had increases in the fraction of the population living in a top sort of half of the tract distribution of socioeconomic status within 4 kilometers of CBDs. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like, here is 1980, and these shadings is the fraction of the population within 4 kilometers that lives in a census tract that's in the top half of the kind of socioeconomic status distribution. And you see a lot of very, very bright blue here, very, very low numbers. Except for New York and Santa Barbara are above a half. A few more cities by 2010. Chicago and Portland are kind of notable that they had downtown gentrification that got their downtowns to be kind of more prosperous than typical neighborhood in the metro. And these are the changes. And so this is really what we're trying to ultimately understand, that you have this big increases in the fraction of the population living within 4 kilometers of CBDs that live in kind of a relatively prosperous census tract between 1980 and 2010. And it's pretty widespread around the country. Okay. And this is not just in terms of kind of means, it also is about the whole distributions. So if we look at, say, fraction white and ask what fraction of census tracts within 4 kilometers of CBDs went up 20 percentile points in the distribution versus down 20 percentile points, or up half a standard deviation or down half a standard deviation, you see this kind of turnaround in the 90s in this dimension of fraction white, turnaround after 2000 in terms of fraction college educated, turnaround in the 80s in terms of median income, and if you kind of put them all in an equally weighted z-score, you see this turnaround that starts in the 80s. Okay, so I'm going to show you a bunch of evidence. When we get to the model, we'll be a little bit more structural about it. But basically, we're going to see these patterns that, in the 70s, you get very clear kind of reductions in demand for central neighborhoods in all dimensions. In the 80s and the 90s, it's kind of muddled depending on the details, which group you're looking at, and exactly how you do it. And after 2000, you see this very robust increases in demand. Okay? And so that comes out in descriptives. Just to get a sense of kind of what the data looks like at the tract level, this is our socioeconomic status index in 1980, and this is the 2010 version. And each of these dots is a census tract in Chicago, and the blacker dots are within 4 kilometers of the CBD. Okay, and so the 45-degree line here on this graph is just the just saying that those tracts didn't change their ranking in the SES distribution. And you see here in the upper left quadrant these tracts that started below the mean and moved kind of up the distribution of the socioeconomic status index. Just looking at the graph, they look to be disproportionately kind of downtown, okay? Downtown near CBD tracts. And I'll show you some regressions that kind of show that that's a statistically significant phenomenon, kind of looking broadly across metro areas, okay? So that's just Chicago. That's just like one data point. Another thing I want to point out is that there is some mean reversion here. So this line here is just the regression line, and it's flatter than, it has a coefficient or a slope of less than 1. And so there is some mean reversion, and we're going to want to worry about that a little bit. Okay? But it seems like this is much bigger than just mean reversion. So what can be driving this? Could be demographic shifts, or it could be, that is, there's a greater fraction of groups who always have been more likely to live in downtown areas just over time. And so minorities have been a growing fraction of the population. Minorities have always lived, or at least in recent years, lived downtown at greater rates. So there's kind of this mechanical demand increases for that reason. And then there could be sort of shifts in demand within specific demographic groups. Okay. And we think of that kind of two classes of explanations for that, those shifts. One is shifts in the spatial structure of labor market opportunities. So we know that the composition of employment, the industry composition of employment in downtowns has become more high skill oriented. And the declines in employment downtowns pretty much stopped around 2000. But I'll show you that they didn't really start growing after 2000. So just looking at that data, you'd need a lot of skill upgrading in labor demand to be driving this. Just to preview the results, ultimately we don't find that that's driving it, but it's going to be important for halting some of the declines. And then the other is shift in amenity values. And so we're going to have observed amenities, unobserved amenities, and some income effects that can drive kind of local amenity demand. OK, so let me show you kind of a bunch of mechanical decomposition, demand decompositions. And then we'll get to the model. And this actually has a lot of the same elements as Amin's paper, though it's not nearly as elegant and beautiful with full general equilibrium. So I give him a lot of credit for doing that. So let's think about the fraction of the population of race R and demographic characteristics X. Think of it as like education group living in tract I in metro area J at time t. Okay, so call that F of I Rx. We can decompose that into the conditional distribution, that is the fraction of the population of race R demographic X that chooses to live in I, or conditional on R and X, times the distribution, the joint distribution of demographics and race in the metro area. Okay? And then the joint distribution we can decompose into a conditional distribution and an unconditional distribution there. Okay? Conditional shares and racial shares. Okay? And this is basically like DiNardo and Fortin-Lemieux's, what they did for wage distributions. We're doing it for allocations of people across neighborhoods. And I should mention Carrillo and Rothbaum have a paper that do something like this to think about shifts in neighborhoods in DC. Okay? So in decomposing these changes in neighborhood demand, I'm going to show you some kind of exercises that use different counterfactual distributions. Okay? So I'm going to have actual data and then sort of calculations based on distributions in which there's no change in anything. And then exercise 3 is calculations based on distributions in which we hold the shares of the population in group X and race R fixed over time, but allow the choices to change as they did in equilibrium. And exercise 4, where we switch and we hold the choices fixed, but allow the shares to change. Okay, so this is going to give us a sense of whether kind of demographic change has been driving central neighborhood change, or whether it's actually been about changes in neighborhood choices. Okay, and then we'll understand. We'll do some more after that to dig in a little bit more. Okay, so to do this counterfactual exercise number 2 here, I'm just going to benchmark to average CBSA population growth. Okay, so I'm just going to give you an average, and then the counterfactual distributions I build will essentially add on to the average how much growth there would, or what the growth rate would be of downtown within 2 kilometer or 4 kilometer of CBD populations under using the counterfactual data. Okay. And this is going to maintain an equal weighting across CBSAs, because I kind of want to think about the average CBSA rather than the average kind of person, okay, to do this. Okay, so if we look at like what's in the data, this is within 2 kilometers, and it gives a pretty good sense for 4 kilometers as well, though a little bit more, a little bit bigger numbers. In reality, there was a 7% decline in population 1980 to 2000 relative to 21% population growth rate at the CBSA level. If we hold shares constant but allow choices to change, then we get a very similar number. Okay? But if we hold choices constant and allow shares to change, then we get a very large positive number. Okay? So what does this say? First of all, you see this opposite influence of choices and shares. And this is because demographic groups that were growing tended to live downtown in 1980. Okay? And the other thing you see is that choices really matter more than shares. And maybe that's not surprising. Okay? 2000 to 2010, you see this turnaround where kind of the downtown population started growing at about the same rate as the metros. But once again, we can infer from these numbers that kind of the fact that these neighborhoods were disproportionately populated by growing demographic groups helped that growth. And the choices effect alone is going to end up being a little bit negative. Because if we hold choices constant at their 2000 levels, these downtown neighborhoods would have grown a little bit faster. Okay? So what I want to do now is I want to show whose choices mattered the most. I think that's going to be instructive for helping us to understand who we should zoom in on for looking at changes in demand. Okay? So just going to build counterfactuals where we hold the shares fixed at, say, the base year shares, and then calculate counterfactual choices with year t for some indicated groups and the base year for other groups. Okay, and so if we look at so then each of these numbers is going to be the effect of the changes in choices by this specific group up there on downtown populations changes between, say, 1980 and 2000. And what you see is that the non-college non-whites and the non-college whites were leaving downtown areas in droves during this period and accounted for a lot of population decline. But after 2000, the non-college minorities continued to leave in droves, and the others did not. Yes, sorry, question?
Can you go back 2 slides, please?
Yes.
OK, I just want to make sure, because I don't work in this literature,
yeah.
I understand what we're looking at. So when you allow, so column 3,
yep.
What you're doing is you're saying, going from 1980 to 2000, you're taking each subgroup, and the subgroups here are education and race. And you're saying, let me take their,
yep.
roughly?
Yep, yeah, education and race, that's right.
OK, and you're saying, let me take, for each subgroup, how many chose to live within 2 kilometers of the CBD in 1980? And how many chose those things in 2000? And you're just saying, how do these change just based on, there's no change in the shares, just the differences in the choice sets, in how they make their choices.
Yep.
And there's no effect for prices here. There's no sort of...
No, I'm not dealing with prices yet. This is totally mechanical.
Okay. All right, I think I understand this. And you're doing the same thing 2000, 2010. You're just saying, I observe their choices, and let me take the population shares I observe of these subgroups, and let me allocate choices and see what we get.
Exactly.
And the only choice here is CBD?
No, this is all the tracts in the metro. But they get aggregated essentially to near CBD. And you could think of it as near CBD and far from CBD. But ultimately, yeah, we do all the tracts in the metro. And we do, in the paper, we do a bunch of other kind of things. But just for the presentation, I just show you this to keep it manageable.
So the choice the household is making is of a tract,
yes.
not just is incidentally a CBD, near the CBD or not.
Yeah, yeah. So we do it by tract and then aggregate up for, in this case, within 2 kilometers of CBDs. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe that was better explanation than I gave.
Well, I bet half the room who does urban understood that.
No, I don't. This was totally new for me to think about how to do this. So I have another paper where I do this in wage distributions, and moving it over to neighborhood choices it's not that far of a jump, but it's not something that's done a lot. So I appreciate the question. OK, so this is just the same thing. It's just these numbers add up to the effects of changes in choices. And you kind of see this continued departures of non-college minorities, but the return of, to some extent, of non-college whites and to a greater extent of college whites. And so this is really what's driving the population, the fact that these downtown populations were growing after 2000. OK. And so then these things here are holding shares constant at the base year. And then there's going to be an additional component that comes from the fact that demographics changed. OK? And so to look at how those contribute to central neighborhood change, we can essentially add those one at a time to our counterfactuals. And what you get is that basically the fact that sort of education groups are changing hurts downtown neighborhoods a little bit, but the fact that racial composition is changing helps downtown neighborhoods. Okay. All right. So we did this with various other joint distributions. The one I want to point out, so age is just we target sort of young people. That looks very much like targeting college. And we target high-income people. That also looks very much like targeting college. The one difference is targeting single and couples without kids. There, you see this kind of mechanical increase because there's been a greater fraction of the population that's single and fewer households having kids. But it turns out that's driven by minorities and not by whites. So there's this kind of narrative out there that we've had rise in childless couples moving downtown, working skilled jobs. That doesn't seem like that's what's going on because those are minorities, and I think most of the narrative is about white people, maybe some minorities, but.
Sorry, are those minorities who don't have children, or minorities who are not married? We look at the household composition. So we look at people who live in households without kids, and that's all we can see. We don't know whether they're married or not. OK? So you're telling me there's more single minorities, more childless minorities?
Yes. Yes. Just because the minority population has been growing. Most of the population growth we're getting is because of immigration. It's not because of fertility among anybody who lives here. OK, so we looked at some other outcomes, and I should get onto the model. I don't have too much time, but basically these decompositions will give you kind of what you'd expect in terms of drivers of central area fraction, white fraction, college, and median income. Okay, given what we just saw with education. OK, so now I want to develop a standard neighborhood choice model and use it to decompose reasons for changes in in these downtown neighborhood choices. Okay, and so we can think of an indirect utility of living in neighborhood I, or census tract I, by group H, household R of group H, as some component that depends on house price, wage, net of commuting cost, and amenities, and then some error. If that's extreme value type 1, then we can write it as the probability of choosing a neighborhood is this, and then invert as in Berry 94 to get this, where it depends the log fraction of people living in census tract I with some adjustment factor, sort of constant adjustment factor is just the sort of modal indirect utility. Okay, and so then differentiating that cross-sectionally, differentiating both sides cross-sectionally will let us express kind of the log fraction living in each census tract I for group H bar as the relative labor market opportunities with a discount for the relative housing cost times the housing share plus the relative amenity values. This is like a Roback type condition. Then there's going to be, if we want to look at another type besides a reference type, call it H rather than H bar, there's going to be some shifter that has to get added. Okay. So this looks kind of like a regression, right? So if we can have measures of wages, and relative amenities, and some CBSA fixed effect, then we can regress log neighborhood choice share for group H plus some house price index times the housing expenditure share on this stuff, and learn about kind of the marginal utility of these things and perform a decomposition. Okay. So the first step is to recover estimates of these lambdas with the neighborhood choice probabilities and housing expenditure shares and tract home prices by narrow demographic groups. So we've done it by education and race, just like the decompositions, and by income decile and race, and by those are the two the main ones, but we do it for some other joint distributions as well. Okay. Let's see. Okay. And these things, these expenditure shares, we're going to measure with the census microdata separately by metro area, because we want to account for some non-homotheticity that could exist separately by demographic group. Okay, so this is going to imply sort of a model-based decomposition, which is going to be limited to some extent by what we can measure in W and in Q. Okay, so we have employment composition, and we can infer from that kind of average wages for downtown areas starting in 1990 and then 2000 and 2010 from the Census Transportation Planning Package data. And then we also have that for the metro area. Okay? And so we can think about changes in neighborhood choice shares for a given group depending on changes in housing costs, changes in local employment opportunities, changes in wages that operate through demand for amenities. And these are wages we can think of as holding the, maybe this is bad notation, but holding the downtown wages constant, kind of incomes, I should say, holding the downtown wages constant, and then observed amenities and then unobserved amenities. Okay? And then there's going to be a CBSA fixed effect that we need to kind of scale everything so the neighborhood choice shares add to 1. Okay? So I'm going to show you regression results like that in a second. But first I want to show you just a specification where we put the socioeconomic status from before on the left-hand side to convince you that these downtown neighborhoods, kind of in a statistical sense, their demands in kind of an aggregated way are looking very different over time. Okay? So we have this employment growth at the metro level, which we'll instrument with a metro level Bartik, and near the CBDs, which we'll instrument with a CBD-oriented Bartik. And those are going to be, everything's going to be those are going to be standardized. Okay? So this is just the SES index on the left-hand side. And what I want to show you is after controlling for these employment growth near CBD and at the metro area level, but making these mean 0, and interacting them with being near the CBD and having CBSA fixed effects, you get this significantly negative coefficient on the dummy being near the CBD in the 70s, and then it kind of goes near 0 in the 80s and the 90s, and it turns significantly positive after 2000, just as kind of you might expect given all the evidence I showed you. Okay? However, when we look at these effects of CBD area employment growth, they're either 0 or positive drivers of CBD SES status growth in the population over the whole period, particularly in the 70s, even though these were declining demand neighborhoods in the 70s. Okay, so I hope that says something that these local labor market opportunities seem to matter, and we're picking some of that up. But if you think of this as kind of like an income effect, that when metro areas are doing better, they have declining demand for downtown areas in the 70s, but increasing demand in the 2000s, that says maybe the income effect, at least for some groups of these downtown areas, have changed. Okay? So I'm going to run exactly the same sort of regression, but put these kind of structurally defined changes in lambda on the left-hand side instead. So this is like neighborhood choice shares adjusted for with housing price changes. Okay? For white college graduates, you see this significant effect, downtown sort of effect that kicks in after 2000. And the CBD-oriented employment growth also seems to matter. It's always positive. Sometimes it's significant. Sometimes it's not. I think we can do a better job with our standard areas here because we're just clustering, and we can do some spatial stuff on them. Okay? But we don't see any sort of significant downtown shifters for other groups. And it really seems to be oriented towards college whites. Okay? So those are kind of, we run regressions like that for every specific demographic group, and there's lots and lots of output associated with them that we can then use to perform this decomposition, which is, you can think of inside the choice shares decomposition I did earlier. Okay? So we're going to have parameters or regression coefficients for each race education cell, which is going to allow us to decompose these total effects, say for 1980 to 2000, before that I showed you that are because of changes in choices. So the less than college non-whites, they contributed to decline in 20%. Their changes in choices contributed to decline in 20% in the population of downtown neighborhoods between 1980 and 2000. So these estimates indicate the reason for that is primarily because of declines in unobserved amenities, kind of holding incomes constant, plus the fact that sort of as incomes of this group grew, these neighborhoods became less, these downtown neighborhoods became less attractive places. Okay, so kind of a negative income effect. And then for the less than college whites, we also have this effect of reductions in downtown employment opportunities mattering to some extent too. Okay. And for the college whites, there's not, it's all pretty small because it adds up to about 0. Okay. After 2000, you see for the college whites, these unobserved amenities end up being the most important positive component. Whereas for the less than college non-whites, everything sort of stays pretty much the same. They've got this declining unobserved amenities component, and the income effect is still negative, though it's not too big. For the less than college whites, we've got once again this positive unobserved amenities component coming in, which is in contrast to the negative from before, and that really matters for turning around their demand for downtown neighborhoods. Okay, so there's something, it's clear that kind of, I don't know whether it's racial attitudes or something about the amenities of downtown neighborhoods that are race-specific changed, but the sort of demand for non-labor market stuff going on in downtown neighborhoods seem to change for whites, but not for less educated minorities in particular after 2000, and that's driving most of this turnaround. Okay, so in conclusion, we had this turnaround of downtown neighborhoods. It's very broad-based, and it really, I think the biggest thing that I learned from doing all this decomposition stuff was really a big part of it was the cessation of departures of less educated whites, accounting for a lot of this. Okay, and so how can we understand it? Well, it's either improvements in amenities or shifts in the valuation of downtown amenities that account for the whites' return, but this mechanism doesn't apply, especially to less than college-educated minorities. Okay, And the improving labor market opportunities did help staunch the outflow of the less than college whites only, but only for that group. Okay, and so I wouldn't say that this is, maybe it's one of the components of downtown changes, turnarounds of downtown, but I wouldn't say it's the main component.
This is just another contribution of what Nate does. And so since it's late in the afternoon, I'm just going to say some random things, but slightly correlated with the paper, focused on unobserved amenities. Folks, I think back 30 years ago when I was a student at the London School of Economics. I was handsome, I had hair, I was 20 years old. I was walking the streets of London, not doing my homework, and I didn't have a cell phone. I didn't know where to go in the city. The city was dirty. It was safe. I knew nobody had a gun, didn't fear anyone, and it was a safe city, but without a cell phone, I didn't know where to go. There was this Time Out magazine that came out once a week, but if I had had a cell phone in 1986, what a different city that would have been. And that's going to be, basically, that's the heart of my comments for what's coming. My son's now applying to college, and there's something about Columbia, Chicago, and Penn to him. These used to be rundown universities. Folks, why did I move to USC? In part because of this slide. Ed Glazer's work on the comeback of center cities as consumer cities. My son is living this right now, and he's very excited to live his life as one of these categories and to be at one of these center cities. And I think USC is capitalizing on this right now. Folks, a couple of things I see at USC. We've spent $1 billion on this university village. I don't know if you've walked around it. We're connecting public transit here. And so I'm very interested, and Nate is doing a detective exercise here, this unobserved amenities. There's very interesting issues in urban economics of the complementarities between private goods and public goods. It's quite a coincidence that as crime fell around USC, that USC builds this $1 billion village to help anchor people down here, and the city simultaneously builds this expo line through town, connecting us to the city center and out to the sea. Folks, a couple of points related to the paper. At the end of the paper, Nate has a very nice discrete choice exercise and links it to Steve Berry's famous work on choice. But I want to make a distinction. In Berry, Levinson, and Pecos, the products are cars. Think of a Mercedes, think of a Volvo. You can write that down in an attribute space of speed, safety, horsepower. You can write down the attributes, and each of those attributes are chosen by the producer. They're bundled into the vehicle. There's intelligent design there, if I can crack a joke. For a tract in Chicago, who is the intelligent entity choosing what's bundled into that tract? In my handbook chapter with Randy Walsh, in our chapter Cities and the Environment, we argue that structural urban is much harder than structural IO because the supply side is an emergent function of what industry and people and other activities are bundled into the local area. And so what interests me very much in Nate's setup, and I fully believe the results he presented, of this rise in this amenity since 2000, I'd love for him to explore more to say something where I get confused and I don't know how to make progress on this. In typical discrete choice models, I live in an area like Beverly Hills because I'm going to allocate my time there. So Penny Goldberg wrote a really nice paper where she said, car guys, you buy a car and then choose how much to use it. She jointly modeled the joint decision of what car do you buy and how much do you drive it. In urban economics, if we're smarter, there's where do you locate and how do you allocate your time. But how you allocate your time, folks, is a complicated function. I'm doing work right now in China. When air pollution's high in China, do people go to outdoor restaurants? No. There are synergies between private decisions and public goods. If there's high crime in an area, you don't go there. What interests me is in this age of Facebook and in this age of Tinder and Grindr, we won't discuss these, of the demand for cities and interactions goes up of this potential. In the model, is there a way to think about how one allocates one's time? And once time, the value of the consumer city is greater if women feel safer in that city, if it's less polluted outside, if your friends are going to join you there. Folks, I started with that example of 1986 London, where I couldn't coordinate with my friends. I didn't know any of their phone numbers, didn't know where any of them were, and had a very difficult time solving the Schelling coordination problem. Now that's simple with the modern cell phone, and it plays to Nate's decadal stratifications. Folks, now let me switch to the supply side. Joel Waldfogel has a really underappreciated paper that complements Glaser and Kolko's Consumer City. In Waldfogel's setup, there are consumer externalities. If I'm the only Jewish guy in a city, is there going to be a deli? When there's in Joe Stiglitz's models of variety, if there's a fixed cost to producing a variety, if there's enough people like me, the average fixed cost is low, and the entrant enters and earns a profit. And so something that interests me very much is sort of a snowball effect. Nate's model had individuals making choices, it playing sort of a Nash game. But in Waldfogel's setup, amenities are endogenous. If there's a fixed cost to varieties, then the private consumer city gets better as there's more rich yuppies there. And if people enjoy a good meal more when their friends are there, technology brings them together. Facebook will know that I'm at Drago tonight and all these nerds will show up. That was a joke. But if I were a cooler dude, that would be possible. And if my utility is an increasing function of eating a nice meal on a low polluted night when I don't get mugged, when other nerds are with me, folks, this is the consumer city, which I didn't have in 1986 as I was wandering around like a freak. I'm jealous. I wish I was 20 again. And so now my son is going to experience something great, and I'm jealous of him. Folks, a couple more points and I'm done. And Nate alluded to this. He's terrific. Gary Becker, if he were with us, would yell at me that I'm still an idiot, but then he would go on to say, Kahn, Baum-Snow, there's demographics here. People are marrying later, and they're having fewer children. Your 20s and into your 30s are a more fun period. And so there's very interesting issues, again, of time allocation and of dynamic programming. How are you setting up your life when you finish your schooling? And this desire, I'm very interested in the willingness to share public space. Nate didn't have housing demand in his model, but again, if home prices are rising in these city centers, can people live in close proximity and double and triple up? I'm very interested in, as crime falls, are we willing to have less private space? We don't need this moat if we trust other people around us. Nate alluded to Lena Edlund's Power Couples paper, and I wanted to give a shout out to Lena's work. Lena and her co-authors have a nice paper, and Nate summarized it, that when you have a power couple, this couple, and if they work downtown, then they have a comparative advantage. They especially demand that space. One of the points I take away from Nate's work is that there aren't, I interpreted Nate's findings, that the push here is not jobs downtown. A relevant paper for Nate here is Rossi Hansberg's paper on firm fragmentation. Rossi Hansberg and a co-author found that with the rise of the internet, firms like Goldman Sachs can fracture their entity, keeping their deal makers downtown and moving middle management to the suburbs. And so this sort of sorting of superstars downtown interests me. But folks, to wrap up, for urban economists to catch up to structural I/O economists, I think there's very interesting issues of how do we capture this unobserved amenity when we as econometricians are trailing the economic agents who may appreciate these complementarities. So Ed Glaser and Jess Gasper 20 years ago wrote the following paper. There were futurists saying that with information technology, we'd all move to North Dakota and live like the Unabomber. Glaser and Gasper argued that technology is a complement of density, and I interpret Nate's paper as exactly on par with this, of showing the trends, very, very well done, of how the population, which parts of the population most value the city center. I wonder if in future work there could be some interesting politics here. There are those local politicians who are worried about this political equilibrium. It would interest me I'm always interested in urban political economy. Could any political boundaries be drawn here of overlaying local political jurisdictions with the census tract data? Would the processes you're documenting be even faster if there weren't urban place-based politicians, the Charlie Rangels, of trying to keep certain equilibria that gave them more voters? And this piece of politics was not in the paper. But as usual, like in Star Wars, the student has passed the master.
So I wonder if your unobserved amenity is observationally equivalent to zoning. And what I was thinking about is, so I think about Los Angeles a lot for obvious reasons. We have zoning in LA that makes it very easy to build downtown and very hard to build anywhere else. Land is expensive in LA, and so when people do build downtown, they build expensive stuff, not cheap stuff. So you're seeing well, we really don't have filter in LA anymore either, but would that be and I think about how Chicago was developed, and the single-family neighborhoods are not going to allow multifamily property to come in, but you have all this stuff going up, near the Gold Coast and the Loop and so on. Since your unobserved amenities is basically residual, yep, right? Zoning could also be a residual. You don't have zoning explicitly measured. Could that be what's driving your result instead?
So, very interesting result, but I wanted to go back to something you said in the presentation, and I listened to Matt's comments. So I thought you were conditioning, your demographic cells were conditioning on the amount of children and...
That was one of the joint distributions, but I could only do one at a time because the census tables only give you joint distributions with respect to one thing and race.
I see. So you can't at this point rule out you mentioned it at some point that we tell this story about the preferences, later childbearing, later age of marriage, and what you're saying. So I've got two questions. First, so you can't completely rule out that sort of story right now, is what you're saying. And then the other thing I wanted to ask is, what is your sort of, and it's related to Rodney's question, what is this shift in, why do they get negative? Why do non-educated whites, not so much educated minorities, but why do non-educated whites what do you think intuitively is driving their disamenity value that's increased from living downtown? Or do you think it's anyway, if you have sort of a gut feeling about this?
I agree, complementarity between cell phones and urban living has risen, and that could be driving a bunch of these results. And I imagine that urban normal goods that you consume downtown, like restaurants, they're complementary with cell phones, but that doesn't really apply for people who are not, college graduates so much, because they're going to do more of their consumption at home. So maybe that's an explanation. It seems reasonable. However, some of this is being driven by high school graduate whites too. And so it does seem like there's a racial dimension that still is lurking there that might be important. I think the zoning issue, that's true that I don't do anything about zoning. However, if that story would, I think, make more sense if the zoning rules systematically were different before 2000 relative to after 2000, because that's...
It's very possible that they are.
Okay. So, that could be, if that's the case, that could be true. Okay. But that could be because they didn't have any reason, they didn't want to build downtown in 1990 as much as they do now too, because of demand side stuff. So, but I agree that, we don't really have anything about zoning. On Andra, just to try to clear up, so the family stuff, yeah, we did the joint distribution with family and race. As separate from education and race, because we'd love to do them together, but we couldn't. And it is the case that there is some mechanical increase in downtown populations because there's more single and unmarried couples. But just as an aggregate fraction of the population, the growth of single and unmarried couples is all driven by minorities. The fraction of the population that's white and single and unmarried has been about constant, because the white fraction has been falling and single and unmarried has been rising, but they've kind of offset for whites, but for other groups it's been rising as a fraction of the population. We were able to construct like 6 types of households out of the census tables, and we don't have anything about age in there. We just, yeah. So we just know whether they're children in the household or not. Yeah. And thanks, Matt, for all those comments. We'll talk more at dinner, and I'll try to figure out what I can do about all that stuff.